make it. We think it's an important conversation. So my name is Brad Bosserman, and I direct the Middle East and North Africa program here at NDN. And this was an initiative that started about 2 years ago after the revolutions that called the Arab Spring. And it was really animated by the notion that our response to those revolutions needed to be an all-hands-on-deck approach. It needed to take very seriously the realities of the youth bulge and of the employment and economic challenges in those countries and how they're inextricably linked to a lot of the political and security issues there and that are going to be important for those transitions, and really about the importance of remaining engaged in the region over the medium and long term. So in the past, we've hosted events and meetings with people, senior State Department officials like Undersecretary Hormats, Ambassador Bill Taylor, as well as senior officials from Treasury, USAID, the Export-Import Bank, et cetera, as well as leading members of Congress. And so I think that as far as those principles and those ideas, there's really very few people in town who represent those better than Congressman Adam Smith, who's here with us today. He has a unique perch and experience as the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, but he's also served on House Foreign Affairs, on House Intel before, and he's traveled tremendously throughout the region, and he really cares deeply about U.S. engagement in the region and has a vision and a strategic vision going forward that few people have. He really is one of the most prescient and strategic thinkers on these issues, so we're very pleased to have him here talk about the future of U.S. engagement in the Middle East and North Africa. So without further ado.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank, first of all, Simon Rosenberg and the NDN for their great leadership, certainly on this issue, but on many others. As everyone who's come to these things is tired of hearing, Simon and I came in together 17 years ago when he formed the NDN and I got elected to Congress, and we've worked on a lot of issues together since then. I think made a positive difference on a number of those. Most recently, Simon is one of the leaders on immigration reform, and an incredible optimist about it, that it still could happen. So he's done a lot of great work here in a lot of areas, and certainly on foreign policy as well. And as was mentioned in the intro, this is an incredibly important topic. And I think the biggest way to think about it is exactly as was described. There is this incredible youth bulge throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And the second big way to think about it is, we are focused on a lot of the politics and a lot of the conflicts between who's going to be in power, what form of government, democracy, stability, all these issues. But really the youth bulge and the economics, I think, are the main challenges there. And essentially what you have right now is an enormous number of young people with virtually no prospects. No job, no economic future, and that is not a good combination. Youth bulges historically are a challenge no matter where they happen, but if they happen in a place that is deeply unstable and completely lacking in economic opportunity, not to mention a large amount of extremism percolating throughout that region, it spells trouble. So one of the big ways to think about this is an economic issue, and what we have to work on is to work with companies, encourage foreign direct investment, work on economic issues, work on ways that the U.S., the West, and NGOs and others can help change that scenario that I just described and actually begin to help create economic opportunity. Now, there's a whole lot of steps to get there, but I think we lose track of that a lot when we're focused just on the politics. The economics drive a lot of those politics. I've been a very strong advocate of foreign assistance and global development plans in the U.S., and I've given a lot of speeches about that. Bless you. And I've always heard the argument that poverty and violence and extremism are not really linked, because my role on the Armed Services Committee, I tend to link those, because when you look at the leaders of these movements, the bin Ladens and others, they tend to be upper middle class, so that's not really the issue. And that is just about the most incorrect analysis that I think I've ever heard, because it is true that the people who come up with these crackpot ideologies that are supposed to save the world may be upper middle class, but they only find a following if there is a lack of opportunity and a large amount of poverty in a given area. The people who have nothing to lose, who have no hope and who have no future, are far more likely to follow those crackpot movements than those who do have a future. So making sure that we build some sort of economic future for people throughout the Middle East and North Africa, I think, is job one. Now, what should the U.S. policy be in making this happen? Well, one of the things I believe about that is we have to be engaged, but we also have to understand that we're going to have a limited role. This is not a problem that we can simply show up and fix for a variety of reasons. One, because it's never really the case that an outside power can come into a country and just turn it around and fix it. A lesson that I trust we have learned through our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. But also there is a distinct lack of trust in the U.S. In that region for some understandable reasons. In the past, it has been perceived that the U.S. has been pursuing only its own interests, has in many cases backed governments that have been contrary to the will of the people, and therefore our credibility in the region is limited. Now, that doesn't mean that we disengage. It just means that we have to be realistic about the fact that we can't simply show up and tell people what to do. We have to help. We have to work with them on engagement, on economic development, on encouraging foreign direct investment. Because these are things we can do. Creating an atmosphere where U.S. companies want to invest in the region is enormously important. And I think it's also important to be somewhat optimistic about that. That you can look at very, very dangerous parts of the world and go, gosh, why would anyone invest there? But there are opportunities. In fact, I'm going on a trip next week to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I've been working with an NGO in that area, the Eastern Congo Initiative, for some time, and one of their big focuses getting U.S. companies to want to do business there, and they've had some success in a place that is very unstable and very problematic, even worse in many respects than the other Middle East, North Africa countries we're talking about. So it can be done if you look for the economic opportunities. And it's also worth noting that, as The Economist wrote about 5 months ago, Africa is one of the, I think, the largest emerging market out there. And the number of countries in Africa are growing, and there's an incredible amount of opportunity there. So you can certainly build off of that in the Middle East and North Africa. I think the other challenge with U.S. policy is there is a certain lack of clarity in that policy. And I think the reason for that is we have multiple goals, and at times those goals conflict. I think we need to be clearer about explaining the tough choices that presents. And I don't mean this to be an exhaustive list, but if I was to say what our goals are in the region, I would say we certainly want to promote economic opportunity and political freedom. We want countries that are more responsive to their people, that give them a voice in their government, and grow their economies. We would also like stability, because in many parts, stability is a key part of that first goal. If you don't have a secure environment, it's very difficult to have economic growth in any reasonable economic system. We also, want to discourage extremism, both from extremist groups in Shiite communities like Hezbollah and extremist groups in Sunni communities like Al-Qaeda. Now, every once in a while, those things are going to conflict. Egypt is the best example of that. The Morsi government, while democratically elected, was also at a risk of encouraging extremism, and also, I will say, not terribly democratic once they got elected. They went about dismantling the constitution that had been built, but they were democratically elected. So if a coup happens, how do we balance those interests to make the right choice? And the only thing I would ask on that is that we do a better job of being honest about that balancing, and not act like every time we make a decision we're doing it because that is our core principle. We've cut off aid from Egypt because a democratically elected government was not thrown out, was not gotten rid of by an electoral process. Let's put it that way. We say that was our core principle, and then people say, yeah, but you're still helping Egypt. So how do you balance that out? What we have to say is we are trying to balance these interests, and we're also mindful of the fact that we don't completely control the situation. So it's a matter of walking that very thin line. I think Syria is another excellent example of how difficult that is. Certainly the Assad regime is illegitimate. I think we have rightly and correctly said that it must go. But at the same time, we have a very substantial presence of Al-Qaeda elements there, of al-Nusra, ISIS, other extremist groups there that we also don't want to encourage. We're trying to balance that. The one thing I will say about Syria that I think is incredibly important is we need to help our friends in that region more than we have. Now, a lot of people have focused on the fact that, well, we can't really change the ultimate outcome like that. That, okay, so we do more to help the Free Syria movement. It's not going to be a game changer. It's not going to enable them to win. And that may well be true, but it will enable them to better survive and better have a foothold in the region. I've long felt that we should do a Department of Defense Title X train and equip mission there, so that we can better support the Free Syria movement. And again, not because I'm under any illusion that that's going to automatically make them win and fix the situation, but if we don't help them, they are less likely to be successful. And we've seen this. We've seen the rise of al-Nusra and other groups that are getting support from extremist elements throughout the region. So I think we need to be helpful to that group. So the number one biggest message here is we need to be engaged, and at the same time understand that we don't control the situation, but that we have an incredible stake in the outcome. Widespread instability and unrest throughout the Middle East and North Africa could lead to wars of many different sizes, and certainly has, leads to economic instability, and is not something that we want. We need to work with our partners to try to make the region more stable, more prosperous, and we need to really focus on the economics. Try to make sure that there's economic opportunity in Egypt and elsewhere. Now, this is, I didn't come here to give you the three-point plan that's going to solve this problem. That does not exist. This is a very, very difficult region. I did come here to say it is one that we cannot afford to neglect, and we cannot afford to have an unclear, muddled policy on. Let us try to be clear, let us try to engage and do what we can to improve the situation in a vital, vital part of the world. Much more that I could say, but I always find these things go better when we have dialogue. So Simon and I will kick it off, and then we'll take your questions and comments. Thank you.
Obviously, from our standpoint, in the effort as an organization that's been involved since we've known each other in trying to broadly promote economic liberalization around the world and invest in a lot of energy in that, we're pleased with your emphasis on trying to put more focus on the long term and sort of the idea that we are so focused in the day-to-day and the tactical that we've got to pull back from time to time and look at a strategic orientation. Having said all that, your thoughts on the immediate. We have, as you talked about Syria, we have the Iran, the new day with Iran. I mean, you saw on Twitter today that the idea that Obama may even go to Tehran is sort of being openly contemplated. How are we doing? I mean, what are you most concerned about in the short term as we look into next year?
Well, I guess what I'm most concerned about is our relationship with some of our allies and friends in the region, depending on how you wish to define them, because certainly we always have differences even with our allies and friends. But how do we build a cohesive policy where we can get Israel and Saudi Arabia and UAE and Turkey and other countries that we've worked with, to be more on the same page? Because I think they have a fairly zero-sum game approach to it, and that is, Iran is the enemy; they must be contained and punished, frankly. And I think our approach is we don't want Iran to build a nuclear weapon. We don't want a war with Iran, so therefore we have to find some way to get along. And I think Israel and Saudi Arabia are very, very concerned about that. And there's a couple of different layers to it. One is the nuclear weapon. And I think the Obama administration weapons of mass destruction as a number one top tier issue. I mean, however we got there, the fact that we seem to be headed down the path of destroying Syria's chemical weapons is a huge positive. Because I'll tell you, whenever we were talking about the threat of an unstable Syria, that was number one, with the sheer volume of chemical weapons they had, and what if they fell into the wrong hands. So being able to contain that was very important. And similarly with Iran, Iran is a bad actor in a number of different ways. Their support for Hezbollah, their support for Assad, their support, in undermining a whole bunch of regimes. They've engaged in international terrorism in many instances. But getting a nuclear weapon is the game changer and the thing that we want to prevent. And I think the economic sanctions have put them in a position where they've had to recalculate the wisdom of pursuing that. But what is the point of all those sanctions if it isn't to force them to the negotiating table to give up their nuclear weapon, give up their pursuit of that plan? And so we're doing that, and we're making progress. And I think there's this false choice out there that we have to somehow make sure that under no circumstances Iran can ever even think about building a weapon. You just can't do that. You can't unlearn what they know, even if they gave up absolutely everything. They could conceivably reconstruct it. So we have to be mindful of striking that balance, and I think the Obama administration has done that. So I think that is promising. Now, what does that mean, more long term on the Hezbollah issue, on Assad, on all those other things? Look, those are always going to be challenges, but aren't we better off if we can have some stronger assurances that nuclear weapons are not going to be part of the equation? Because ultimately, if you interpret what Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, basically he wants to back Iran into a corner and force them to capitulate. Basically, sanctions until, and I would be all for that if I thought it was possible. But far more likely, backed into a corner, they will say, "Oh hell, we better build a nuclear weapon because that's the surest, defense we have against regime change." So you got to be really careful about pushing extremist people into a corner from which there is no way out. So it's number one on Iran. On Syria, as I said, I think I didn't say this, I think our policy has been muddled and not well thought out, and I've explained that in some other remarks I made elsewhere. We've sort of stumbled into an okay place on the chemical weapons, but I think our lack of support for the Free Syria movement and our lack of involvement has, made it more difficult for them to be successful, made it more difficult for more extremist rebel groups to rise up, so that we're pushed closer to that impossible choice of Assad versus a chaotic, somewhat Al-Qaeda-led Syria, which I don't think is the choice. I think there are, the overwhelming majority of Syrian people want something different than that. But absent help and assistance, how do they survive? How do they prosper? How do they become successful? When you have jihadists and extremist groups from other places certainly showing up and supporting al-Nusra and the other extremist groups. So I don't know how I would evaluate how we're doing. I think we tend to be a little overly critical of how we're doing because there is this presumption again that somehow if we just did it right, everything would be fine. Not the case. So I think we're probably doing better than people give us credit for, but there's unquestionably room for improvement in terms of having a clearer and more consistent policy.
It's a great way to kick it off. So let's open it up to the audience. We do have a mic because this is being recorded, and so if you can raise your hand. Yes, sir. And please introduce yourself and ask away.
Morning, Congressman. Thank you for joining us. My name is Adam Arley. I'm Vice Chairman of Mercury and was previously U.S. Ambassador to Bahrain. And so my question to you is about military assistance as a tool of foreign policy. If you could comment on your thoughts on that. Specifically, I was recently in the region and heard from a number of people in Bahrain, senior officials, that who were leading the government's engagement with the opposition, who said that the best thing that America could do for us in terms of giving us, aiding momentum in our engagement with the opposition, is to release the holds on military assistance. Because the conservative elements in the royal family, are digging in their heels because they see the United States as acting against them, so that the reformers say, we could get cover from these guys if you would just release the holds on the equipment.
I'm sorry, I'm not, who are you talking about?
In the royal family, Bahrain.
In Bahrain?
Yeah,
Okay.
Bahrain. And so, but also with regard to Egypt, the basic issue is withholding military assistance an effective, in your view, and I guess it depends on the circumstances, but looking at Bahrain, looking at Egypt, do you see it as an effective tool of foreign policy? And what are your thoughts more generally on the issue?
Well, by and large, I don't have a problem with us, providing military assistance. I think it's a way to build a relationship. It's a way, obviously, to contribute stability and security. It really gets into the larger difficulty that we've had in the region. What happens when your friends don't behave in the way that you would like them to? And we have that problem in Egypt and Bahrain. And they are not, by any stretch of the imagination, democratic regimes. There are all kinds of problems there. And if we are loudly proclaiming to the world that, we are here and we are working with you because of our support for representative government and free and fair, how do we go about supporting a government, that clearly doesn't meet that high standard? Well, I would say part of it is, first of all, up front, explaining that that's not our only objective. That's not our only objective, number one. And number two, it's not as achievable as it may sound. It's not like if, we just go, hey, stop that. That Bahrain or Egypt or anyone else is going, okay, we'll fix this. So it is a delicate balance. I think at this point you would have to say that withholding military assistance has not proven to be an effective policy. On the other hand, I do think we need to reserve the right to say, we're going to monitor this relationship, and if things go on, we're not in a position to support you because we have our own domestic pressures. We have our own concerns. I mean, it's the huge problem. You want to use it as leverage, and the ideal outcome is that the country you're using it as leverage with goes, okay, we'll fix this, this, and this in exchange for that. Unfortunately, frequently the outcome is, well, we're not going to do that, and then you just wind up in an increasingly tense relationship. So I don't have an easy answer for that. Like I said, one thing I would say is that we make clear that we are balancing competing interests, and just because we are providing military assistance to a country doesn't mean that we endorse absolutely everything that they do. I think you can do both. I think you can say, here are the interests for why we're continuing to provide military assistance to Bahrain and Egypt, but here's what we disagree with what they're doing. And we're going to try to work hard to fix it, but nor can we afford to lose all of our relationships in the region. So I wish I had a clearer, bam answer for you. No, but that's the balance that I would try to strike.
Thanks, Congressman. It's always great to have a chance to hear you talk about these issues. Nelson Cunningham at McClarty Associates. I've actually got a direct follow-up to Adam's question specifically about Egypt and military assistance. We were sitting down with a client just this week trying to help think about how to deal with a public health challenge in Egypt, which the Egyptians have to deal with. They don't have the money to do it. And that caused us to look at the funding levels that the U.S. has had available for different sorts of aid to Egypt. And as I know you're aware, we've given billions for military assistance, but over the years, the amount we have for economic stabilization has been cut in half. We now have, I think, just $250 million a year that we have able to pay for a whole range of programs in Egypt that could be, when you think about it in this environment, very good people-to-people outreach as a way to help create both economic growth there and find ways to knit the Egyptian people and to change their perception of the U.S. So my question for you is, given that we have withheld substantial amounts of military assistance to Egypt in the wake of whatever we want to call it this past July, and there are hundreds of millions of dollars that will not be spent on arms and military assistance for Egypt, is there the prospect of that money being reprogrammed so it can be used for economic stabilization, health, education, citizen-to-citizen exchanges in ways that don't cause complicated issues of, oh my gosh, where do we find new money in this difficult budget environment, but that allow us to continue reaching out in the right ways to Egypt while still maintaining the principle that we want to limit the military assistance at this complicated moment in their history.
Yeah. Two quick points to that. One, I've long been an advocate of greater development assistance and greater economic assistance as opposed to military assistance. Secretary Gates, when he was that Secretary of Defense, made this point over and over again that to bring security to a region, development is every little bit as important, more important than security, and we are unbalanced in that way. That the emphasis has been too much on military aid, and I think we should look for places to provide more economic assistance and less military, and I think that would be an option. Whether or not we can do a one-for-one thing with Egypt, I don't know, but certainly I think we should emphasize our efforts to help them economically and help them in terms of democracy. There are a whole bunch of programs out there and a whole bunch of things that can be done that are not the military. Second thing that's worth noting about this that I should have said in my first answer is there's a U.S. industrial base argument here as well, because a lot of the military assistance that we're providing is money so that they then buy military equipment from the U.S. And particularly as our Pentagon budget is coming down, from its historic highs, you've got a lot of our industrial base, a lot of our military contractors who are trying to keep lines open for one thing or another, and foreign military sales are a critical piece of that. And I say that, and I think there are people who would say, well, gosh, that's we can't be selling arms around the world just to make sure that defense contractors don't go out of work. That's horrific. Well, it's not actually, for two reasons. One, we're talking about jobs. You look at the line for a C-17, for instance, which is probably going to shut down now. There's a ton of jobs involved there. It's an economic issue. And then second, the industrial base argument is a legitimate argument. We want to be able to maintain our ability to build the things we need to properly defend ourselves. So that's not something that can be completely ignored in that equation. But I do think that the focus on economic assistance is a much, much better way to go.
Nelson, just one point of information is that a year ago, the State Department and the administration pushed what they were calling the MENA Incentive Fund aggressively, and the Senate passed it and actually plussed up. They asked for $775 million. I think the Senate ended up providing $1 billion altogether. It was a bipartisan effort. Lindsey Graham was actually the leader of the effort in the Senate. The House Republicans actually stripped it out of the foreign ops bill. In a moment when we were at a more innocent phase, perhaps, of the post-Arab Spring moment in the region, the House Republicans made it clear that they have no interest in providing even modest aid in this regard. And it was a really, to us, it was an incredible loss. We worked on this quite a bit in this project, and it was an incredible lost opportunity in reality, but also from a messaging standpoint, that the U.S. wasn't going to stand with these countries who are in transition in the way that we should, given the historic interests we have in the region. So we've still got a lot of work to do to build greater support inside of Congress for this kind of more far-sighted approach to a region in transition. Yes, sir.
Stand up so you can see me. Sure. Charlie Kestenbaum. I'm an old-school Arabist. I apologize for I know Nelson well. If you indulge me with a brief story, which will lead to a question. In 2003, I was in Baghdad as a private businessman, and in the red zone, and the former Minister of Electricity came to our house, and he said, "I need to tell you a story that you need to tell the Americans." He said, "In 1991, when you bombed us into oblivion, into the Stone Age, Saddam Hussein called me into his office and sat me down. He put his gun on the table, and he said, 'That's my gun. You have 6 months to get the electricity back up to speed, and you can use that gun to shoot anyone you need to, who's in your way. At the end of 6 months, I'm going to call you in, and I'm going to see whether the electricity's on or not. If it's on, you keep your job. If it's not, I use it to shoot you.'" Now, they got the electricity back on. He said, "I'm here." Okay, so it worked. 10 years later, they're still having massive blackouts. And so that story leads to the question, which is, given what we've just said about economics and the point you made in your initial presentation about how important it is it how realistic, I mean, really seriously here, about the huge imbalance in our military as opposed to our diplomatic and our economic aid support programs. How effective can we be? I mean, how can Jabhat al-Nusra do more to help people in hungry people in Syria than the United States can?
Right. Well, we are doing quite a bit to help a lot of hungry people throughout the world. For some reason, a lot of people don't notice it. I was in Jordan visiting the refugee camps up near the Syrian border, and the refugees that we met with were very upset and said, you know, the international community is doing nothing for us, and, you know, they're not helping at all. And, like, I'm looking around at the refugee camp, which is half paid for by the U.S. and entirely paid for by the international community, and listening to someone tell me that we're doing nothing to help them. What do you do? What do you say? I don't know. I do not, in any way, shape, manner, or form, agree that al-Nusra is doing more to help, you know, Muslims in need in the United States of America. It's just statistically untrue. But there is a certain lack of faith that people in that part of the world have in the Western world, and we always have to wrestle with that. You know, but you know, we could do more, certainly, but I think it's a credibility issue more than it is a more issue. We should do more, but no matter what we do, it seems like there is that credibility issue overhanging it in those parts of the world that makes it more difficult. Now, you know, sometimes we, you know, in response to the tsunami in 2004, I think it was, in Thailand and Indonesia, and that gained a lot of credibility in that part of the world. So I think there is some recognition of it, but there's still, as you know, being familiar with that region, an inherent skepticism about Western intentions that knows no logical bounds. So that's going to be difficult even as we make that change. As far as the Saddam Hussein story is concerned, you know, look, you know, dictatorships have their advantages, but that's not the way we want to run the world. I mean, as you were telling that story, I was thinking about Sun Tzu and the Art of War, and how he explained that you can train any group of people to do it. So, you know, to basically be good soldiers, and you know, trained a bunch of geisha girls, I gather, to be good soldiers, and the ones who didn't pay attention, he killed them. And then everyone else was like, oh, okay, I guess we'll go ahead and do this. That has a certain effect, but I wouldn't call it exactly the way we want to run the world. You know, there's a humanitarian aspect to it that places limitations on it. And I'm not unmindful of the fact that in some cases makes it more difficult to get things done, but there's a human element here that says we're simply not going to go into Baghdad and say, you know, we're going to kill you if you don't fix the electrical grid. I guess, you know, I was going to say that's not the way civilized people do things, whatever that may mean, but I will stand by the statement. That's not the way civilized people do things.
Here, we'll go here and here and then here. So we'll go, Brad will take individually, yeah, and then we'll, yeah.
Hi. I'm just wondering about foreign assistance, the development and economic assistance. How do you build that support in Congress? It seems like, and this is following on the discussion earlier, that any time a country isn't acting as we'd like, the reaction in Congress is to first cut that assistance. So how do you work on that?
You know, I think we need to better make the case, because I think what members of Congress are faced with is they just want to make a statement. You know, they want to be able to say, hey, we care about this. Well, how do we care about this? We're cutting them off. And I think we need to continue to argue that the wisdom of that is very limited. You lose your influence, you lose your ability to help people. And, you know, I think, you know, some of it is there's a lot of bad memories when the U.S. was, you know, more actively engaged in helping, you know, bad people just for the sake of the fact that they were allies. I mentioned the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I mean, we helped put Mobutu in power because he was an anti-communist and he systematically destroyed the country for 30 years. We don't do that anymore. We genuinely try to help countries in a more comprehensive fashion. And, you know, I don't have a great answer to the question. I think, you know, it identifies a problem in our policy, because it's not just military assistance that people want to cut off when a country when some country does something bad is it's comprehensively, we're not sending money to them. And then that just makes the problem worse. One of the things that we can do is work with NGOs that are engaged. And I know your work with the MCC, there's a lot of crossover there. And I was at this event on the Global Fund on tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS earlier this week. And there's a lot of ways to coordinate between the private sector and the public sector. So even if it's a matter of public policy that we have to make a statement, we can work with some NGOs and try to continue assistance. And beyond that, I think those NGOs have a lot of great ideas for how to do it, and we should take advantage of that and partner. But yeah, there is that lashing out problem. And similarly, Congress has the problem of, the lack of flexibility in foreign assistance funds, because we all want to identify our program. All right, this is our program, this is where you got to spend the money. And there's just a lack of flexibility for USAID and others to do it in a more intelligent way. And again, that's driven by sort of congressional imperative of I got to have my name on something. Just saying I'm in favor of foreign assistance isn't the same as saying, I'm supporting educating women in Namibia. That's something you can sort of hang your hat on. So Congress causes a lot of problems.
Let me just say,
there's no question.
let me just add one other thing, Katie, is that, look, we're having a similar debate domestically in the U.S. about what are the elements, what creates growth and what creates broad-based economic opportunity. I mean, the president I think there's an ideological dimension to this that's important, that is consistent both in the way that we look at the rest of the world and how we see our own domestic politics, that we have to do a better job, those of us here, in connecting the dots in the ideological approach. I mean, there is broad consensus among economists about what creates growth, right? In terms of investment in infrastructure and skills and the things that we all have been talking about here for 17 years. And it's neither right now the way that we're approaching our own domestic politics. We have the lowest investment in public investment since the end of World War II in the United States right now, in a time when there's rising global competition around the world, where our workers and our companies need more, not less. And the same thing could be said for how we're approaching the rest of the world. So I think there is a big ideological conversation that we have to lead about what the right approach is towards creating broad-based prosperity here and around the world. And it's frankly a lot more simpler in many ways than we have often made it in our family. But it's certainly one of the reasons we're here today is to help broaden out this conversation. As the pivot to Asia may come, and as we have lots of focus in Latin America and other parts of the world, our approach to this region is still going to be central to American foreign policy for a very long time. And we have to do a better job in how we're looking at it, I think, strategically, and it's one of the reasons why Adam wanted to come today. So let me take 3 questions, and then we are. I'm sorry, guys, I pointed to you, but maybe, Adam, if you can stick around for a few minutes and shake a few hands.
Well, why don't we, actually, I know I've got someplace to be, but let's go ahead and take those questions, and I'll
do a quick
answer as quickly as I can.
So we had here, and we had one back here. So there are 3. So start, hands up. He'll take all 3 together.
Christy Delafield with the Syrian Opposition Coalition. My question is about the assistance issues inside of Syria. We give a lot of funding through the United Nations, and they do great work. But in Syria, they're only able to access, 40 to 60% of the country.
Right.
What do you see as the solution to that? There's this polio outbreak that the regime is not letting them to go to. Are there things we can do at the UN or with our allies, or do we shift the funding to independent groups?
Yeah. Well, I think that there are a lot of independent groups that are actively engaged there. I spoke with the folks, I think it was at CARE and some others that are very actively engaged. And if we have to shift it to them, we have to shift it to them. But ultimately, look, the solution is, a stable Syria. You can't get aid to every corner of a place that's in the middle of a war zone. Peace is the only solution to that. In the short term, yes, we can try to, keep working on whatever group you can get to whatever corner, but it's always going to be piecemeal and ad hoc until you have a peaceful Syria. I wish I had a better answer.
We're doing these. Let's just take 2 together, Adam, and then see if you can wrap them.
Sure. My name is Shahad Qureshi. I'm a student of Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University's International Studies program, and I just graduated from Jackson School at the University of Washington.
Oh, cool.
I have a question about the opportunity for Iran-U.S. rapprochement under the new Rouhani government. We just passed a deal, but often even the scapegoat that the supreme leaders use for saying, oh no, he controls everything and we can't, it's not a real reform in Iran. But he was endorsing the deal and he's aging in the first place. So what do you think about the opportunity for U.S.-Iran rapprochement in the future, A, and B, what do you think about those in Congress who are trying to increase sanctions when the deal is being discussed?
I'll hit this quickly. I think it's a huge mistake to increase sanctions at this point, and I think we need to look for an opportunity to find a way to peacefully coexist with Iran. They're never going to be a great actor. That is, if we can figure out a way to remove their threat to Israel, reduce their malign influence in other countries, and get them to stop making a nuclear weapon in exchange for them having some reductions in sanctions so that they can move more. I think that's something that we need to try. I'm eyes wide open. I don't trust Iran, never will, but they are a fact on the ground, a fact of life. So if there's a way to find a way to more peacefully coexist, it's something we got to look for. Yes, sorry.
Hi, I'm Zaina Bustani from the Cohen Group. My question is a little more general. I wanted to try to understand the link of where you see energy independence and the prospect of U.S. becoming energy independent and how that's going to impact the strategy going forward of engagement in the region. Is it going to liberate the U.S. or is it going to change alliances? How is it going to impact it?
I mean, it's going to have profound impacts in a lot of different places, obviously. Within the Middle East, I mean, it's going to reduce somewhat the influence of those regions, but they're still going to be an enormous producer of energy. And I think the real issue there is having a more diversified economy, not being totally dependent upon energy. Because even in the places where it's robust, that leads to all kinds of societal problems when you don't have a more broad-based economic base, when you're not making anything, when you're not inventing it, and then eventually, prices go up and down as an impact. Look, they've got to diversify the economy to the extent that, more energy being produced in the U.S. forces them in that direction. That's probably a positive thing because they've got to get there one way or the other. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.